Hello, welcome to Interprepedia. My name is Rosa. I'm an interpreter, and it's been a while since I posted a video, but it was because over the last few weeks I was in full study mode for phase one of the Federal Court Interpreting Certification Examination, which is the written test. Oh my God, that was a mouthful. If you want to know how I studied, whether or not I passed, and valuable tips I'll share along the way, make sure to watch until the end. I just took the test a couple of days ago and I wanted to make this video while everything is still fresh in my mind so that I don't leave out any important details. I'll start by sharing some facts about this test before I share my personal experience. But if you are familiar with the test and want to skip ahead, check out the timestamps below and jump to the next section of this video. The Administrative Office of the United States Courts oversees the process to become a federally certified interpreter. At the moment, this certification is only available for English Spanish interpreters. Technically, there are no specific prerequisites to take this exam other than meeting the qualifications listed in the handbook. And it's basically up to the interpreters to decide to go for it if they feel qualified. In the handbook, they do encourage us to do a self assessment to gauge if we're ready by answering a series of questions and by taking a practice test, but that's about it. It's a two-phase examination administered in alternate years. The written test is in even years and the oral one in odd years. The first step is to check out the US Court's website to find out when the enrollment will be open and the testing dates. After you have that information, you'll have to visit Prometric's website to book your test. This is the entity that administers the test. The cost this year was $210. The test is a computer based test. All questions are multiple choice and it's divided into two sections, English and Spanish. There are 200 questions total. Each section has 5 parts, and in order to pass, you must score at least 75% per section, meaning in English and in Spanish. But it's a global score per section, but not per part. So you don't have to score at least 75% in reading comprehension and usage and so on. What counts is your overall score per language. So now, my experience. I enrolled in a course with trans interpreting 5 months before the test, and I feel it was key for me to be able to pass. This is the course I purchased, and as you can see, it has 18 hours of instructions, including lectures from expert linguists in English and Spanish. On top of that, there's a generous amount of material for self study, like exercises, vocabulary lists, and mock tests. By the way, I paid for the course out of pocket, so I am not sharing this for any personal gains. This is my honest opinion because I love trans interpreting and I respect Edgar very much as an instructor because he is very knowledgeable and he has taught me great tips to pass other tests. My main takeaway from the course was learning the logistics of the test and specific tips to do well on each part. If you take this course or whatever course you choose, my advice would be to print everything out as soon as possible. I started the course and I attended a couple of live classes, and after that, I was dormant for a while. Then I started going through all the lectures, and when I was done with all of them, I printed all the practice materials. And I feel that it wasn't until then that I began studying more seriously. Printing the material was great because I could carry it with me and study wherever I went. Another thing I did was to borrow this GRE prep book from the library. This book is awesome because it has different study programs that you can follow depending on how much time you have. And it has a lot of different vocabulary and reading comprehension exercises. Once I felt I had covered all the material I could in the time that I had, I decided to go for the practice tests. I already had the ones offered by Trans Interpreting, the one offered for free by the FCICE, and I also purchased one of the practice exams offered by the University of Arizona. So I took the practice tests offered by Trans Interpreting, and my scores were 82 for English and 90 for Spanish. Then I took the practice test offered by the FCICE, and my scores were 88 for English and 91 for Spanish. I decided to take the University of Arizona one last, and my scores were 74 for English and 61 for Spanish. So I failed both sections. You can imagine how I was feeling when that happened just a few days before the test. My confidence plummeted and I was questioning everything that I had been doing so far, but I slept on it and I decided to face it with renewed energy the next day. The next phase in my study plan was to review the mistakes I made in every practice test, and I realized something very important. While practice tests are great and they were key for me to pass, they're not perfect, at least not as perfect as the FCICE. Let me give you a specific example to explain myself better. In the practice test by the University of Arizona, there was a question in the error detection section, and one option was blah, 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 an unusual blah, blah, blah. Obviously, I did not mark that as an error because unusual starts with a vowel, and as far as I know, the preceding AN is correct. But according to their answer key, it should have been marked as an error. If I am totally getting this wrong, someone please correct me by letting me know in the comments. Another thing I noticed is that the reading comprehension questions from the real test were easier to answer than ones in some of the practice tests. Even though the texts were very complex in the real exam, the questions were well formulated and straightforward without any subjective elements. So, in general, I feel that some items in some practice tests were harder because they were more confusing. When I realized those things, I felt a little better and more hopeful that maybe those low scores were not going to be a reflection of how I was going to do in the actual test. And I embraced a positive attitude to try my best. The day of the test, when I arrived at the Prometric Center, I had to show my picture ID. They gave me a locker where I had to put all my belongings. And then, after a thorough security check, I was escorted to my station. They gave me 2.5 hours to complete the test, but first there was a 10-minute tutorial to help me become familiar with the test, which was really helpful, mainly because I used that time to stretch and breathe and calm down. And to my surprise, the system has a tool to highlight and strike out text, which was extremely helpful. There's also a tool to mark questions if you have doubts and would like to check them at the end. And you can also skip questions. The first section was the English one, starting with the reading comprehension part. That is what took me the longest time. I liked the computer format more than the paper format because the screen only shows one question at a time, so I was able to fully focus on the question right in front of me. I was done with the English part in just under an hour, and the Spanish one took about the same amount of time. I decided to just tackle the questions in the order in which they appeared and marked the ones I wasn't too sure about. When I finished, I had about 45 minutes to review. The test gives you the option to review all the questions or just the ones you marked. Since I felt I had enough time, I reviewed all the questions. I have to confess that I did the eeny, meeny, miny, mo in one of the questions because I had no idea, but I felt confident about all the reading comprehension answers, the language usage questions involving legal terms, and most of the error detection questions. The trickiest parts for me were the usage because there were words and expressions that I had never heard in my life, and also the translation section because in the real exam, most of the options seemed like acceptable options. I clicked the end button 7 minutes shy of the 2.5 hour mark. Then I was invited to complete a survey where they asked me about my background, like where I learned Spanish and English, if this was my first time taking the test, and things like that. After that, I got a screen with my scores confirming that I passed, and I got 89% in English and 91% in Spanish for an average of 90%. If we go back to the practice tests, my scores in the trans-interpreting practice were very close to my real scores. And the scores I got in the FCICE practice exam were basically identical to the real deal. So to me, that shows that those tests are very well done. When I finished, the technician printed my scorecard, sealed it with an embosser, and signed it. Very official. If you are taking this test, I wish you the best. And now for me, the real challenge begins because in a few months, I will attempt to pass the oral exam. But for now, thank you so much for watching. Adios.